All right, welcome everyone. My name is James Epstein-Reeves. I'm the president of a consulting company called Do Well Do Good, based here in Chicago. We consult companies large and small, nonprofits you never heard of, to Dow Jones listed companies everyone has heard of, on their corporate social responsibility and sustainability strategy. What we're going to talk about today is really just kind of set the stage for your business plans and just kind of create a framework around sustainability. What it is, what it isn't, what the opportunities are, and what are maybe some things to kind of keep in mind as you're working on developing your business ideas. What I'm going to do today is actually start out by playing a word association game. What I'm going to do is put an image up there, and what I'd like you all to do is just kind of shout out the first couple of words that come to mind, and just keep going. Like, don't stop with the first word. Just keep going. Shout as loud as you can. Don't need to raise your hand. This is whole group participation. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Yep.
Anybody going to leave me hanging? It's going to be really awkward if it's dead silent. So, what comes to mind when you see this image?
Nike, just do it.
Switch.
What's that?
Shoe.
Switch shoe?
Switch.
Switch, okay, keep going. Michael Jordan.
Shoes.
Okay, so I've done this a couple of times, and it's interesting how often sweatshops and child labor comes up when you bring this up. So we're going to just do another image, and what comes to mind when you see this?
Cheat. Abuse.
Abuse? That's a record right there. So often...
Blue light special.
What's that?
Blue light special.
Blue light special. Often this brand is kind of associated with discrimination against women, poor pay, poor benefits offered to their employees. And I find this really interesting that these two brands, for all the success that they've had in business of becoming such a large brand, such a large company, cannot escape the baggage of previous business decisions. Nike in the 1990s was accused and found to use child sweatshop labor in the supply chain. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But kind of what I wanted to have is three takeaways from this talk are the following. That corporate responsibility is much more than just philanthropy. That businesses that act on their corporate responsibility efforts can and are actually ahead of the game, can be and are ahead of the game. And that corporate responsibility is not as easy as black and white issues. And so what we're going to do is talk about the old guard of corporate responsibility versus the new guard. We're going to create a definition of corporate responsibility, do a couple of quick case studies, and then open up for just questions, answers, and kind of open floor. You'll hear me a couple times throughout this presentation start to use different words just out of habit. So corporate responsibility and sustainability and corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship. These are all different terms that are thrown about, and I would argue that about 95% of the definitions, respective definitions for all of them, mean the same thing. And we could get an academic discussion about what the differences between sustainability and corporate social responsibility are, but I think for simplicity's sake, we'll just treat them all as equivalent and synonyms. So let's talk a little bit about the old guard of sustainability and corporate responsibility. And old guard is pretty much encapsulated best by this guy, who's Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who once said, first in his book called Capitalism, and then second in an article that was published a couple years later, that the one and only one social responsibility of business is to increase profits for shareholders. And it's a very limited view of corporate responsibility in the role of corporations. This quote is kind of thrown about all the time at corporate social responsibility conferences, and usually discussing how misguided Milton Friedman was. He was very much a free market thinker. But I actually argue that indeed Milton Friedman actually set the foundation, the intellectual foundation for corporate responsibility kind of movement. Milton Friedman was afraid of a couple of things, a lot of things. But one of them was, if you look at kind of the archetype of like super duper uber capitalism, it's Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, who, if you've ever seen the original Wall Street, it's actually just a really great movie. The second one, but he was afraid of this guy who I think might be who Milton Friedman thought just encapsulated what capitalism is. He was afraid of him turning into this guy, just a hippie. And this is nothing against hippies. Hippies, I have friends that are hippies. I'm all for rock and roll and peace and love. But I think this is kind of what Milton Friedman was afraid of. And he was also afraid of Uncle Sam turning into a Frankenstein monster of government. And he actually used this kind of phrase in his writing, that he was afraid of a Frankenstein government coming to take over capitalism. And in looking at that, it's really just kind of, I think, a sign of the times. He wrote this in the 70s, and at that time, it was East versus West, capitalism versus communism. A very different business context, intellectual context, economic context than what we live now. So I think Milton Friedman was actually more just afraid of communism coming onto the shores of the United States and on the Western world. And in fact, in his writing, he outlined a couple of cases when corporate social responsibility efforts are acceptable and not acceptable. So for example, if an executive uses company funds to donate to a charity that he or she believes in, this actually is something that Milton Friedman would be against, because it's essentially taking money from the shareholders and being used for personal purposes. However, he outlined a case that if there's an employer in a small town that takes investments and takes money and invests into the local education system, that this is actually in the long-term interest of that company, because it's essentially training its future workforce. So that was an example of it being okay. He was actually even okay with just donating to charity, for a company donating to charity, to a certain limit. And that limit for him was defined as soon as it becomes no longer advantageous from a tax perspective, tax deduction perspective. So he even said, companies can give money to charity. Essentially, his argument boils down to, if you're a business and you're sole proprietor of that business, what you do with your company's money is your decision. However, the moment that you have shareholders, the moment that you take in funds from other people who have expectations of your business, that is no longer solely your decision and solely your funds. You have to take that into account and take all the shareholders' perspective into account. So now let's talk about the new guard. I mentioned before about Nike, we talked about it, and Phil Knight is the founder and CEO, or co-founder and CEO of Nike. When he was CEO, he said this, that the Nike products has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. Now, if I were a brand manager at Nike, this would kind of worry me. There's a lot of baggage with the Nike brand. And right about the time that Nike's supply chain was being discovered for having these practices in the supply chain, this woman had an issue as well. She had a clothing line at Walmart, and this is Kathy Lee Gifford. It is an absolutely atrocious picture of her. Not the most flattering, but I think rather than me tell the story, I'll show a quick video that is a lot funnier than